The neon sign hadn't worked in 31 years, but at 6 in the morning, in the gray Oklahoma light, you could still read it if you knew where to look. Kaplan. Half the letters were rust shadows on cracked glass tube, and somebody had shot out the O with a pellet gun sometime around the Carter administration. Under it, the canopy sagged over 2 dead pumps like a drunk man leaning on a fence post. Weeds had come up through the concrete in a neat row, like they'd been planted on purpose. Josie Kaplan stood in the gravel lot with a coffee going cold in her hand, looking up at the thing she'd just spent $11,100 on, which was every dollar she had left in the world, and said, out loud, to nobody, "Okay, we can work with this." From inside the dark service bay came a sound like a rusty hinge deciding to have an opinion. That was Gasket. Nobody had told him the building had changed hands. 2 months before that, Josie had been living in Tulsa, 27 years old, with a business plan for a mobile coffee cart that had made perfect sense on paper and then fallen apart in the particular way that plans do when your business partner stops answering his phone and takes the espresso machine with him. She came home to Millbrook, population 1,400 and some, on the old alignment of Route 66, because that's what you do when the city eats your savings and spits out the bones. She moved into the spare room over her parents' garage, which her mother, Renee Kaplan, had converted to a craft room the week Josie left for college and never quite forgave her for reclaiming. Her father, Sal Kaplan, ran the hardware store on Main and mostly communicated in grunts and screwdriver sizes. He didn't ask Josie what she was going to do with her life. He just left the classifieds folded open on the kitchen table some mornings, like a man leaving out cheese for a mouse he respected too much to trap. The gas station had been sitting there the whole time, the way certain buildings just are. Background scenery you stop seeing. Ferris Petroleum had built it in 1954. All porcelain enamel panels and a flying wing canopy. The kind of clean, futuristic thing that made sense when Eisenhower was president and everybody believed in tomorrow. Chet Ruddick had run it from 1961 until the interstate bypassed Millbrook in 1978 and killed the highway traffic overnight. After that, it limped along as a garage, then sat closed, then sat boarded, then sat forgotten, then became the subject of a town council agenda item every couple of years titled, with real bureaucratic poetry, Disposition of Blighted Structure, Old Ferris Site. The town wanted it gone. Ron Pafko, the building inspector, had condemned it on paper twice, only for the demolition money to fall through both times, because Millbrook's budget for knocking down eyesores was roughly the size of its budget for parade confetti. So it sat, and it rotted a little more every year, and everyone agreed it was a shame and a hazard and worth exactly nothing. Josie saw it different the first morning she really looked at it, walking to the diner for a job she didn't yet have. She saw a canopy with real structure under the rust. She saw enamel panels that just needed cleaning, not replacing. She saw glass service bay doors, still there, still swinging on their tracks when she pried one open with a crowbar and a swear word. She saw good bones. Nobody else in Millbrook had used that phrase about the Ferris station in 40 years. She bought it at the county tax auction for $11,100, which was, as the auctioneer put it, more than it's worth and less than you'd pay for a used truck. And everyone in the room turned to look at her like she'd bid on a haunted house, which, in a sense, she had. "You bought the gas station," Renee said, in the tone of voice usually reserved for medical diagnoses. "I bought the gas station. The one they've been trying to bulldoze since I was pregnant with you." That one. Renee sat down at the kitchen table like her knees had put in a request. Sal, over by the sink, said nothing, but he did go get his tape measure, which from Sal counted as an enthusiastic response. Chuck Deem, who occupied the second stool from the end at the Millbrook Diner every single morning of his adult life, found out at breakfast the next day and could not have been more delighted if she'd announced she was marrying an alien. Josie Kaplan bought the Death Trap gas station, he told the counter at large, like a man reporting a moon landing. How's the gas station Café coming, Josie? Pumping any customers yet? It became his opening line every morning for the next year, evolving slightly with the seasons. Pumping any regulars yet? Pumping any profit yet? And Josie, God help her, started looking forward to it. The first person to formally show up and try to stop her was Ron Pafko, who arrived on a Tuesday with a clipboard, safety glasses he didn't need indoors, and the weary energy of a man who has condemned this exact building in his head so many times that finding it still standing personally offended him. "You know this whole roof's asbestos tile," he said, tapping the clipboard. "I had it tested," Josie said. "You're right. It's asbestos cement shingle, not friable, unless we cut into it wrong. Abatement contractors coming Thursday. Licensed. Bonded. I've got the paperwork if you want it." Ron blinked. He had clearly expected to deliver news, not receive a rebuttal with documentation. "Well," he said, recovering, "what about lead paint? Buildings from '54. Every coat on it's gonna... Tested for that too." XRF reading came back positive on the trim, like everyone's trim from 1954. "We're doing wet sanding and encapsulation on anything we're not stripping to bare metal, full containment on anything we are." She showed him the second folder. Ron looked at the folder the way a dog looks at a card trick. From the dark of the service bay, a low, rattling hiss announced itself, and a one-eyed orange tomcat, the approximate size and temperament of a cinder block, stalked out onto the concrete apron and glared at Ron with the single-minded hatred of a creature who recognized government paperwork on sight. "That your cat?" Ron asked. "That's Gasket. He was here before me. I believe he considers himself the previous owner. Cats can't own property. Try telling him that." Gasket, for the record, did not care what anybody told him. He had lived in that service bay for going on 4 years, hunting mice and sunning himself on the warm concrete and losing an eye to some dispute nobody had witnessed and he wasn't saying much about. When Josie started hauling out junk, he supervised from the hood of a dead 1967 Ford pickup that had been rusting in Bay 2 since the Ford administration. No relation. And when she finally got the old gas pumps cleaned up enough to stand upright as decor, he adopted the top of one as a permanent throne, and would, for the rest of this story, be found there at almost any hour, surveying his kingdom with his remaining eye slitted in supreme disdain. Ron came back 6 more times over the next 4 months. Every visit he found a fresh reason to frown, and every visit the frown got a little less convincing, because the answers kept being right. He was, underneath the clipboard, a genuinely careful man, and careful men respect being met with better care than they expected. The real gut punch came in month 2, and it had nothing to do with paint or shingles. Every gas station built before 1988 has underground storage tanks, big steel cylinders sunk in the ground to hold the fuel, and Ferrous Petroleums had been down there since 1954, and nobody, in all the years of "let's tear this down," had ever actually pulled a permit to dig them out. Josie had known the tanks were there. Chet Ruddick himself, 86 years old and sharp as a filed axe, had told her so over pie at the diner the week after she bought the place. 3 tanks, Chet said. 2 regular, 1 premium. Buried about 6 foot down, out under where the pumps used to be. We had a leak on the premium tank sometime around 71. Didn't think much of it then. Nobody did. Just topped it off and kept selling. That sentence, delivered between bites of cherry pie, cost Josie $18,000 she did not have. The environmental assessment she was required to get before any food service permit would even be considered came back exactly the way Chet's story predicted, petroleum hydrocarbon contamination in the soil around the old premium tank, spread out under about 40% of the lot. Not catastrophic, the environmental consultant told her, but real. The kind of thing that meant excavation, soil testing, disposal of contaminated fill at a certified facility, and tank removal done by a licensed contractor, all of which added up to a number that made her sit down on the curb outside the county extension office and put her head between her knees for a solid 2 minutes. This was the money pit moment. This was where every sensible person in Millbrook, if they'd known, would have told her to walk away and let the county have its bulldozer after all. Instead, she went to Bev Toomey. Bev Toomey was 79 years old, had spent 41 years restoring old buildings across 3 states before her back finally told her no, and now lived on the edge of town in a Victorian farmhouse she'd rebuilt herself twice, and she had opinions about everything, most of them correct, all of them delivered with the warmth sanded off, but the care still underneath, like a plank that's been through weather but is still good oak. Bev had been watching the Ferris Station project from a lawn chair she'd started bringing to the lot most afternoons, drinking coffee Josie brought her and offering commentary Josie hadn't asked for and desperately needed. "You look like a woman who just found out something expensive," Bev said, the day Josie came out to the lot with the assessment report in her hand like it was a dead bird. "Contaminated soil, around the old tanks. It's going to cost more to fix than I paid for the whole building." Bev didn't say anything comforting. She never did. She said, "Did you check for a brownfield grant?" "A what?" "Brownfield." States had a cleanup grant program for years. Money set aside for exactly this. Old, contaminated commercial sites nobody else will touch, because otherwise nothing ever gets redeveloped, and you get exactly what this town's got now, which is a rotting gas station nobody will fix and nobody will tear down. Call the State Department of Environmental Quality. Ask for the Brownfields Voluntary Cleanup Program. Bring your assessment. Don't let them tell you it's only for big developers, because it isn't, and I will personally drive down there and say so. It took 11 weeks, and more paperwork than Josie had filed in her entire adult life. But the grant came through. Not the whole amount, but enough, combined with a state tax credit for the balance, that Josie could afford the tank removal and soil remediation without selling a kidney. The 3 old tanks came out of the ground on a Thursday in October, rust-eaten and dripping, and got hauled off to be scrapped. And Josie stood at the edge of the excavation and watched 40 years of nobody's problem finally become somebody's solved problem, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since the auction. "Cheaper to clean up a mess than to keep stepping around it," Bev said, watching the excavator work. "Write that one down somewhere you'll see it again." Josie didn't write it down. She didn't need to. She heard it again 8 months later in a completely different context, and it landed like a dropped anvil. But that comes later. With the tanks gone and the soil hauled off and tested clean, the rezoning fight started, and it was, in its own way, worse than the tanks, because the tanks were dirt and the rezoning was people. The lot was zoned automotive commercial, a leftover category from when half the town's economy ran on the highway trade, and getting it changed to allow food service meant a hearing in front of the same town council that had spent a decade trying to condemn the building for demolition. She stood up at that hearing in a clean shirt with paint under her fingernails anyway, because paint under the fingernails does not come out for town council meetings, and laid out her case. The assessment, the abatement plans, the grant paperwork, site drawings for parking, a letter from Bev, unsolicited, 4 sentences, devastating. That said in part, "I have restored buildings in 3 states, and I have never seen better bones than that station's. And if this council tears it down, you will be the first town in my professional experience to demolish an asset to build a parking lot for nothing." The council, several of whom had personally voted to condemn the place twice, granted the rezoning 5-2, with the mayor muttering something about, well, can't hurt to see what she does with it. Ron Pafko, sitting in the back row in his off-duty capacity as a private citizen, was heard to say, "At least her paperwork's good," which from Ron was practically a standing ovation. The building work itself taught her more than any classroom could have, mostly by failing at her first. The roof, flat and built up with tar and gravel back in '54, had been patched so many times over the decades that it was less a roof than a historical record of bad decisions. It leaked in 6 places she found immediately, and 2 more she found only after a March rainstorm turned the ceiling of what would become her dining room into a slow brown waterfall. She'd tried patching it herself the cheap way first, with roofing cement from Sal's store slapped over the worst spots, and it held for exactly 19 days before the next hard rain found a new low spot and dripped straight onto a stack of drywall she'd just bought. That failure taught her the actual lesson, which a proper roofer explained while shaking his head at her patch job. On a flat roof, water doesn't run off, it pools, and any patch that isn't feathered out wide and sealed to a slope, even a slight one, just relocates the leak instead of fixing it. She ended up replacing the whole membrane, a modified bitumen system this time, tapered insulation underneath to actually push water toward the drains instead of letting it sit. Expensive, necessary, done once, correctly. The wiring was its own education. The building still had cloth-insulated knob and tube wiring in the office section, wiring that had been ancient when Nixon was in office, and Josie made the mistake, early on, of thinking she could just leave the parts that still worked and only replace what was obviously dead. Sal, of all people, put a stop to that one. The closest her father came to lecturing her the entire project. "Insulation on that wire's so old it crumbles when you look at it," he said, holding up a foot of it he'd pulled from a wall cavity like a dead snake. "You get one short in a wall with no way to see it. You don't get a warning, you get a fire. Rip it all, do it once." She ripped it all, did it once. An electrician brought the whole building up to modern code, and Ron Pafko, on the visit to inspect that, found genuinely nothing to frown about, which visibly unsettled him. The health department permit was its own mountain. A grease trap installed and plumbed correctly to keep fry oil and food waste from clogging the town's sewer line. A commercial exhaust hood over the range with a fire suppression system built in, because you cannot legally run a kitchen griddle without one. A 3-compartment sink for washing, rinsing, and sanitizing dishes by hand, since she couldn't afford a big commercial dishwasher yet, and an ADA-compliant restroom, which meant tearing out the old cramped single-toilet room Chet Ruddick's mechanics had used and rebuilding it wider, with grab bars and a door that swung the right way and turning space for a wheelchair, none of which the original building had ever considered because nobody was thinking about accessibility in 1954. Every one of these she got right eventually, and every one of these she got wrong at least once first, usually because she tried to save money by doing it close enough, and close enough is a phrase the health inspector does not accept. But the failure that actually hurt, that she still winced about a year later, was the neon sign. The Kaplan sign, she never changed the name, just let the old Ferris family name that was already up there double as her own last name, which everyone in town found extremely funny and slightly eerie, had a beautiful patina to its porcelain enamel panels, decades of sun fade and rust bloom that gave the yellow and blue paint a soft, worn glow you cannot manufacture. Josie, itching to see it look new again, took a wire brush and a bottle of aggressive enamel cleaner to one panel one Saturday afternoon while Bev was at the dentist. And by the time Bev arrived the following Monday, Josie had stripped nearly a third of the original finish down to bare, dull metal, chasing a shine that wasn't there to be found. Bev looked at it for a long time without saying anything, which was worse than yelling. "You can always take more off," she finally said. "You can't ever put it back. Restoration's not about making it look new. It's about knowing what not to touch." Josie had to have that panel repainted by a sign specialist who worked from old photographs Chet Ruddick dug out of a shoebox, matching the original Ferris blue as close as modern paint could get, and it came out fine, good even, but it never quite had the same soul as the two panels she hadn't touched, the ones still wearing 40 years of weather like a good coat. She kept the touched-up panel anyway, on the back corner where fewer people would clock the difference, as a kind of penance, and told the story against herself to every reporter who ever asked about the restoration, because Bev's sentence had landed the first time as a scolding and landed the second time, months later, as the whole philosophy of the place: know what not to touch. The old tile in the entryway, cracked but original, stayed, just cleaned. The glass service bay doors stayed, on their original tracks, now sliding open in summer, to let the dining room spill onto the old apron. The pump stayed, dead and gleaming, repainted only where rust had actually eaten metal. The dead neon got its tubes replaced by a sign restorer 2 towns over, at a cost that made Sal whistle through his teeth, but when it buzzed on for the first test one evening in July, casting blue and yellow light across the gravel for the first time since 1978, even Ron Pafko, standing there with his clipboard for once forgotten in his truck, said, "Well, hell," which was as close to poetry as Ron got. Opening day was a Tuesday in September, nearly a year after the auction, and it was small, and it was shaky, and it barely covered its own costs. Josie had budgeted for 40 customers and got 11, most of them relatives. Renee cried a little, not from joy exactly, more from the sheer relief of the thing finally existing and not, in fact, killing her daughter or the town's fire code. Sal ate 2 slices of pie without comment, which from Sal was a 5-star review. Chuck Deem showed up at the counter. There was a counter. She'd kept part of the old parts counter and refinished it, and ordered coffee and a slice of buttermilk pie, and said, "So, you finally pumping customers?" And Josie said, "11 of them, Chuck. Don't wear yourself out counting." And he laughed so hard he nearly choked on his pie, which pleased him even more. Gasket, for his part, marked the occasion by immediately jumping into the newly installed bakery display case the moment the glass door was left open half an inch, curling up next to the pies with the serene confidence of a cat who believed the entire case had been built for him, which, as far as he was concerned, it had. Josie put up a little hand-lettered sign that said, "Display case pies are for sale. Display case cat is not," and left him there, and it became, within about 3 weeks, the single most photographed thing in the building. The growth after that wasn't a montage. It was a chain of specific things, each one only happening because the thing before it had actually worked. First, it was the coffee, which was simply good. She'd learned real ratios and real roast profiles during her failed cart venture in Tulsa, and that knowledge hadn't gone to waste after all. It had just been waiting for the right building. Word spread slow, the way it does in a town of 1,400, one truck driver mentioning it to another at the truck stop 20 miles up the highway, one Facebook photo of the glowing neon sign against a purple evening sky getting shared around by people who'd grown up in Millbrook and moved away, and felt something twist in their chest seeing the old Kaplan sign lit again. Then it was the pie. Renee, mortified about the gas station for a solid year, discovered somewhere in there that she had opinions about pie crust and started coming in twice a week to supervise, which turned into baking 2 pies a week, which turned into baking 12, which turned into Renee having a genuine paid part-time job at the cafe she'd been so embarrassed to tell people about, a fact she mentioned to her book club with a pride so total it nearly erased a year of mortification in a single sentence. Then a food writer from the Tulsa paper drove out on a slow news week to do a piece on Route 66 nostalgia stops, expecting a novelty, and left having eaten the best chess pie of her professional life, and wrote 600 words that ran with a photograph of Gasket asleep in the display case above a caption that read, simply, "The Management." That article did more for the Café in one Sunday than 4 months of word of mouth had managed. Weekend mornings started to have a line out the door, onto the old apron, past the pumps, people taking pictures of the sign before they even got inside. Then came the account she hadn't expected. A small chain of antique shops along the old highway corridor started sending customers her way as an informal package deal. Shop, then eat, then photograph the pumps, and a regional bed and breakfast association put her on their recommended list. And by the following spring, she was booking out weekend brunch 2 weeks in advance. Something that had seemed like a joke a year earlier when 11 people showed up on opening day, and 8 of them were family. Somewhere in the middle of all that growth came Grant Whitlow. Grant Whitlow drove up in a car too clean for the gravel lot, wearing the kind of casual blazer that costs more than casual, and introduced himself as a regional investor who'd fallen in love with the concept after seeing it written up twice more, once in a regional magazine and once, memorably, on a morning television segment about unexpected small-town revivals. He bought a coffee, ate a slice of pie, admired the neon sign with real and not entirely feigned appreciation, and then sat across from Josie in a booth and laid out a plan for 6 Kaplan's fill-up cafes across 3 states, built new from the ground up in a vintage gas station aesthetic, with her as the concept originator and a consulting fee and equity stake that made her blink twice. She thought about it for exactly 4 days, which she considered, given the number involved, a genuinely reasonable amount of restraint. What killed it, in the end, wasn't the money, which was real and tempting. It was standing in the dining room on the 4th night, closing up, looking at the actual tile floor Chet Ruddock's mechanics had walked on in actual 1961, at the actual pump Gasket was actually asleep on top of at that actual moment, at the one deliberately imperfect neon panel she'd left as a lesson to herself, and understanding, the way you understand a fact in your body before your mind catches up, that none of that could be built new in 6 other towns. You could build a replica of a gas station. You could not build 40 years of a building sitting empty, accumulating a specific kind of soul. And you could not build a Gasket. And you could not build a Bev Toomey, sitting in a booth every Thursday critiquing your pie crust. 6 locations would be 6 competent replicas of the one true thing, and the one true thing would be diluted 6 ways trying to supervise all of them at once. And Josie had learned, over one very long year, exactly what Bev meant about knowing what not to touch. This time the thing she wasn't going to touch was the whole idea. She turned Grant Whitlow down over pie, which she thought was a nice touch, and he took it well, better than she expected, and left his card in case she changed her mind. And she never did. And the cafe stayed exactly one cafe, on exactly one lot, on exactly one old stretch of Route 66, in exactly one town that had spent a decade trying to bulldoze it. The town council, the same one that had voted twice to condemn the Ferris station for demolition, now referred to it in an entirely straight-faced agenda item the following spring as the anchor business of the Main Street Revitalization Corridor, a sentence that made Josie laugh so hard she had to sit down when Sal read it to her out of the county paper. Ron Pafko still came by for inspections, dutifully, on schedule, and Gasket still hissed at him every single visit without fail, a tradition neither of them showed any sign of abandoning, though Ron had taken, in private, to bringing a small bag of cat treats he swore he only carried for a different job. Bev Toomey had her own booth by then, the one nearest the window with the best view of the pumps, and she still climbed a ladder she had no earthly business climbing whenever Josie needed a second opinion on something up high, and she still refused payment beyond coffee and pie, though she had, grudgingly, allowed Josie to put a small brass plaque under the counter, out of general view, that read simply, Bev Toomey knew what not to touch. Chet Ruddick came in most Fridays, sat at the counter, and told the same 3 stories about the leak in 71, and the time a traveling salesman's car caught fire in Bay 1, and the summer the highway got bypassed and business died in a single terrible month. And every regular in the place had heard all 3 stories a dozen times, and every regular in the place listened anyway, because a building like that deserves to have its stories told inside it instead of about it. Chuck Deems still asked her, every single morning without fail, some variation of the same question, and by the 2nd year it had become less a joke and more a kind of civic liturgy, the thing that meant the day had properly started. Pumping any customers yet, Josie? Booked solid through Sunday, Chuck. Well, hell, he'd say, shaking his head like it still didn't quite make sense to him, which, in a way, it didn't, and in another way, it made all the sense in the world. And in the front window, on the cushion Josie had finally given up pretending was for anyone else, in a patch of Oklahoma sun that moved slow across the glass all afternoon, Gasket slept, one eye closed and the other simply not there to close, utterly unbothered by any of it. The tourists, the photographs, the neon buzzing blue and yellow against the evening, the council members eating crow with their pie, the whole unlikely, improbable, thoroughly alive thing that used to be a worthless gas station nobody would touch and was now the best thing to happen to Main Street in 20 years, and was, as far as one battle-scarred, one-eyed tomcat was concerned, and had always been, entirely his.